was a much smaller place back then. The book that I've written is the product of a number of years of work. I will never again try to write a book that has about 1,200 footnotes in it. It started when I was at the Center for Global Development, and it was really something that came out of my experience being at the policy planning staff at the State Department. During that time, as you recall, we had some difficulties in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, which you're probably all quite familiar with. And I was not involved in Iraq policy, but I was struck, having done some work in the 1990s on post-conflict reconstruction when I was at New York University, at the degree to which we we hadn't really learned anything from our major what everyone thought about the invasion, of our major involvement in some of these countries. And yet there had been, in the academic community, quite a bit of research talking about what are the needs in post-conflict environments. And I was also struck by the increasing tendency, particularly after 9/11, to talk about weak and failing states as as Kay said, the conventional wisdom being that they were disproportionately responsible, dysfunctional governance in the developing world, if you will, is disproportionately responsible for some of the worst transnational security threats that we faced. I even wrote some things to that effect that sort of weaseled their way into some of the statements of senior policymakers like Colin Powell. And then once I left the government, I decided to find out whether or not the things that I had been trying to weasel in were actually true, which is part of my strategy for employment. It sort of guarantees full employment. You can create statements, and then you can then find out outside in a think tank as to whether or not they were true or not. And so this book really is an effort to try to figure this out. And so it begins with a chapter on state fragility and state weakness. And what do we really think about? What do we mean when we mean fragile state? And I use those synonymously, fragile and weak. And then the remaining 5 chapters look at specific transnational security threats that U.S. government officials, international officials at places like the World Bank or the United Nations, and also other foreign governments have routinely associated with state weakness and fragility. And those chapters are on transnational terrorism, particularly the movements of the global Salafi jihad, of which Al-Qaeda is the primary representative. The second is on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The third is on 6 different forms of transnational organized crime, and I'll have more detail on each of these. The fourth sort of thematic chapter is on energy insecurity, and the final one is on pandemic disease. And each of the chapters starts, if you will, with a major statement by a public figure saying why weak and failing states are the reason why this is are at the root of all of these problems. Now, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the last 20 years, which have been given the unfelicitous phrase the post-Cold War era, could be called the era of the failed state. After decades of confronting the Soviet Union and sort of major power competition, the United States found itself often, willy-nilly and often surprisingly involved and embroiled with some of the most wretched and weakest countries in the world. I'll just name a few. Somalia, obviously, with the sort of famous Black Hawk Down episode after the humanitarian intervention there. Afghanistan, of course. Haiti, numerous times. Liberia, numerous times. Pakistan, and now Yemen. And this trend began in the early 1990s with a shocking outbreak of violence, particularly in the Balkans, but also in Central Africa, the experiences of Rwanda, etc. And it led a lot of people to think that there was a new world disorder rather than a new world order that President George H.W. Bush had hoped for. Now, this spawned a number of things, and one of the things it spawned was these indices of state failure or state weakness. The most famous of these is the Failed States Index that comes out in Foreign Policy magazine every year, but there are others, including one that I did with a colleague who was at the Brookings Institution who has gone on to bigger and better things, my colleague Susan Rice, who I have known since junior high school, but I was a year behind her in junior high school, and I'm quite far behind her now. But she was gracious enough to work with me when I was at the Center for Global Development on this index of state weakness in the developing world, which was an effort to try to think about the institutional strength of 141 developing and transitional countries, basically not the wealthy advanced market democracies or the sort of wealthy Gulf sheikdoms, is basically all the other countries practically. Um, and whenever these indices come out, U.S. foreign policymakers actually pore over them for sort of clues as to whether or not some country is going to go belly up, or what's the trajectory of this or that country. And I think it really does. It testifies to the belief that vulnerability, strategic vulnerability for the United States now comes from some of these countries with big problems. And you've seen this straddling the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration. It's actually sort of a rare moment of continuity between the two. Hillary Clinton has described the chaos that flows from weak and failing states, and in fact, one of her justifications for why the United States should get involved in Libya was the worry that it would become, quote unquote, another Somalia. Secretary of Defense Gates, who obviously is a holdover from the previous administration and left only recently, he said, if someday we are confronted by a major American city reduced to rubble, or hundreds of thousands of Americans dead from a biological agent, odds are it's a great likelihood that that will have emanated from an ungoverned space around the world where there's not sufficient state control and public order. So again, these were major assumptions, and I thought it was time to actually take a closer look at these statements. And the brutal truth that I talk about in the book really is that the vast majority of weak, failing, and failed states pose a major threat only to their own inhabitants. This does not mean, I hasten to add, this does not mean we turn the other cheek or look away from them. But we have to think of them more as a humanitarian and development imperative necessarily than a security threat to ourselves. And that has resource implications. These countries, we think about them, have been referred to as the countries that host the bottom billion, that are furthest from the Millennium Development Goals that you're probably familiar with. These countries suffer from lower negative economic growth. Their populations are more likely to be poor and malnourished. They experience pervasive insecurity and endure incredible amounts of gender discrimination and often gender violence. They lack access to health care, education, modern technology, and they tend to die young, and before they die, suffer from chronic illnesses. You can think about a situation like Nigeria, where per capita annual health care spending is $10. Now, we're sophisticated enough to know in the United States that the amount that's actually spent on health care is not necessarily a one-to-one correlation on the quality of health care. Still, $10 is not a lot of money, and the longevity in Nigeria, average age of death is 46, which is close to home for me since that's my age, and I'm not ready to go yet. Or you can think about a country like Zimbabwe, whose authoritarian leader Robert Mugabe has basically driven that country into the ground. These countries tend to be the locus of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes, whether man-made or, in the case of the cyclone Nargis, for instance, that hit Burma a number of years ago, sort of a combination of natural and man-made. And they also tend to be sites of great humanitarian atrocities, some of the worst in the world that might cause one to invoke the new norm of the responsibility to protect, which is the international community's responsibility when a country either makes war on its own people or fails to prevent war from being made on its citizens to actually intervene. Beyond the price that fragile states face is the next highest price is not by the sort of international community writ large, but tends to be their neighbors. You've seen a lot of sort of regional conflict formations around the world. You can think about the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, for instance, but probably the one that springs most to mind is the Great Lakes region of East Central Africa. In the wake of the Rwanda genocide, there's been huge amounts of warlords and militias going back and forth, incredible amounts of depredations, particularly against women, but also illnesses, epidemics, etc., refugee flows, what have you. And even when there's not actual violence, World Bank economists have calculated that just one single state falling into the quote-unquote fragile state category can reduce the income over several years for that country and its neighbors at the astounding level of $85 billion, which is 70% of what the wealthy world spends on foreign aid globally every year. So you can imagine that it's a very important development issue. The book says, however, such troubles, as grievous as they are, and why they warrant our attention, tend to be often localized and spread much less to our own shores than one might imagine. We do live in an interdependent world. You know, the financial crisis has proven that, etc. But particularly when we're talking about the most wretched countries in the world is a little bit more like Vegas than we sometimes suggest, right? I mean, that what happens there stays there. You know, other people say that's not the case, but for these countries, I think that's particularly the case. Now, the theory of the failed state threat really gathered steam in the 1990s. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the journalist Robert Kaplan, who's just always a wonderful writer. But he really portrayed luridly this threat from failed states in an essay, I think it was in the Atlantic, called "The Coming Anarchy," and then he sort of put it into a larger book form. And he basically predicted that, you know, what we were seeing in Sierra Leone and some of the sort of problems in the Caucasus, etc., would sort of gradually expand, not necessarily to encompass the entire world, but that the world would be increasingly ungovernable as a result of this. And this actually influenced the Clinton administration, not just that article, but also what was happening in the Balkans, etc. And among other duties that Vice President Gore had during his time in office was to chair something called the State Failure Task Force, which was an interagency effort to try to, you know, figure out where the next shoe would drop, if you will. That being said, this remained largely an academic exercise during the 1990s. The way I would describe it is that weak and failing states, they would tug at our heartstrings sometimes, and occasionally they would loosen our purse strings. But by and large, they were considered third-tier national security concerns. In fact, a number of critics, particularly Republican critics, said this was foreign policy as social work. Why were we actually getting involved in these countries? That changed dramatically after 9/11, because what happened on 9/11 was that a terrorist group based in one of the most wretched countries in the world, probably a country that's probably, you know, second or third worst in terms of its human development indicators. I mean, that had been, you know, through war, was, you know, verging on the Stone Age, was actually the place that an attack on the United States, that's the most grievous attack on the United States in its history, was launched for the cost of about $500,000. And Osama bin Laden, before he was killed, at some point he reckoned that, or boasted that, Al-Qaeda had gotten a million-to-1 return on its investment in terms of the expenses that this generated in the United States. Sort of extraordinary. But, you know, it was taken as the archetype for the fact that, look, great power competition may still be out there, but forget it. It's not countries that have too much sovereignty. It's countries that have too little sovereignty. It's vacuums of power that really bother us. And the Obama administration has, I should say that this was encapsulated in 2002 in the national security strategy of the United States during the first term of the Bush administration, when that document said in the preface, I think, George W. Bush said, "We are now less threatened by conquering states than we are by weak and failing ones." And this has continued quite a bit in the Obama administration. If you look at the quadrennial diplomacy and development review, a lot of that was about creating an expeditionary capability and civilians that could go out and work in some of these fragile state environments. The CIA over the years has identified scores of what it calls ungoverned spaces that could be hosting illicit activity and, you know, terrorism and other illicit activity. Within the Pentagon, the regional combatant commands, and there are several, as you know, regional combatant commands is how the Pentagon divides up the world. A major focus of that work, particularly the new Africa Command, but also Southcom, Southern Command, which deals with Latin America as their area of responsibility. They spend a lot of time these days talking about what the military calls Phase 0, or shaping operations. Now, this is a little bit arcane, but every war plan that the military has a number of phases, right? And, you know, we messed up in Iraq because we didn't have a Phase 4 sort of post-conflict plan. You know, but Phase 0, it sounds sort of Orwellian, but it was this notion that, I mean, it's probably well intended, that it's better to prevent conflict, right, than you know, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, etc. So maybe that the U.S. military should see what it could do in league with other U.S. agencies to try to help prevent conflict. So it's just an example of how even the military has taken this on board. Whether or not conflict prevention should have a military face is another question, but they've taken it on board, and USAID and the State Department as well. The most sort of breathless example of this new view, this new conventional wisdom, comes from a USAID document, U.S. Agency for International Development document, which has this breathless prose, which I loved and cited, and it runs like this. When development and governance fail in a country, the consequences engulf entire regions and leap around the world. Terrorism, political violence, civil wars, organized crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, infectious disease, environmental crises, refugee flows, and mass migration cascade across the borders of weak states more destructively than ever before. So, wow, that's pretty scary. I mean, and it's particularly startling. I mean, in a government document, I mean, that's pretty startling. So it's pretty frightening. But the question was, well, is it true? And 10 years after 9/11, I think it's time to sort of reassess some of these things. And a closer look which is what the book really argues, is that the connection between state weakness and transnational security threats is far more tenuous and far more complicated than these sweeping generalizations would suggest. And it's largely based on sort of anecdotal evidence and single cases. And if you think about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, it's an interesting question. Now, people debate whether or not that situation was a terrorist-sponsored state, since Al-Qaeda had a lot of resources, or a state-sponsored terrorism. But it's pretty clear that the Taliban was in control of about 90% of that country during the time that it was launched. And so it wasn't simply that this was sort of an ungoverned territory, etc. I mean, this had endorsement from the Afghan government at the time. So that's just one example. The purpose of the book is to look beyond these anecdotes, to try to get a little bit more fine-grained about what we mean by state weakness and fragility, and then to look at in depth at some of these actual connections between state weakness and transnational security threats. And then at the end of the book, I provide some policy recommendations. Just briefly, in terms of the way I think about state weakness and how I think we should think about state weakness and fragility, I define state weakness as the inability of a country to fulfill the four main goods, or deliver the four main goods that have become to be associated with modern statehood. And those are the provision of basic physical security of the population from violent conflict and control of borders and territory. That's the first one. The second one is to establish and maintain legitimate, transparent, and accountable political institutions that are reasonably efficient at delivering things. The third is to foster an environment conducive to sustainable and hopefully equitable growth, and basically has an environment that's conducive to entrepreneurial activity. And then the fourth is really a social welfare one. It's the ability to deliver on basic social welfare to its citizens, in particular in healthcare, education, and also sanitation and water. And those four things, I mean, I'll be the first to say that there are active debates in the United States of America as to the degree to which the government should be fulfilling each of these things. But if you look around the world, by and large, those four main pillars have largely been recognized, at least some aspect of them, as being legitimate for the state to be doing, and what a state, in effect, does. Now, some of these things have changed over time. 100 years ago, the notion that the United States should be offering Social Security and Medicare was not really part of the major discourse. So things and expectations change over time and get relitigated all the time. I also want to acknowledge that if you look around the world, a lot of what we call weak and failing states have, frankly, never been viable states. And partly that's the legacy of the colonial and imperial enterprise. Now, one can overdo this. It's been a while since decolonization, et cetera. I have some sympathy with people who get frustrated and say, look, at some stage, people have to get their act together. But the fact remains that many of these countries their boundaries are totally artificial. We're drawn in the chancelleries of European capitals and the Congo Conference in 1885 with no bearing on the sort of ethnic, political, the economic, and otherwise viability of these countries. Left a lot of diaspora populations outside, gave rise to irredentist movements, etc. So we're not working with a lot of great raw material in many of these countries in terms of thinking about strong, resilient states. Now, what the book introduces an index of state weakness in the developing world, which I did with my friend Susan, with Susan Rice, and it tries to rank countries around the world on the basis of how of basically these four categories of state function. Uses about 20 different indicators that are based from the World Bank and a lot of other sources. And it's not that different than some of the other indices that are out there, but we wanted to build our own. But a critical point that I want to make is that when you think about state weakness, it's not simply a question of capacity and institutional resilience. You have to think not only about capacity, but you have to think about will. In analyzing any fragile state, you have to say to yourself, is this a question of just the fact that the institutions and resources don't exist, or is it that there's a venal government that is not allowing these institutions and resources to actually deliver the goods of statehood to their citizens? And those are very important. That's a very important distinction to make. It's probably the most simplest. It's probably the first cut you should take when you're looking at some of these countries, because it allows you to distinguish between countries that have the will and the way. And so you think in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly Botswana, Senegal up until recently, although the leader's getting a little dodgy, he's going to run for another term, said he wasn't going to, etc. So maybe on the political front that they're falling down a little bit. But by and large, a reasonably good performer. But then you have countries that have the will but not the way, and there are a lot of post-conflict countries like this. In Liberia, Nobel laureate, one of three Nobel laureate, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, she's trying to do the right thing. She's got a great academic background and practical background of the World Bank, etc. But she is facing a situation where, tough situation on the ground and a really resource-strapped situation. Fortunately, she's getting some support from the United States and others. But there's a case of the will but not the way. Then you have other countries, and you think about Zimbabwe about 10 years ago, when it still had aspirations about being the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa, and yet has been driven into the ground by Robert Mugabe, despite the fact that it has all this potential. Nigeria is another case too, which has sort of really become just such a kleptocracy over the years. So let me move on now. I should say that those distinctions are very important because they inform the kind of incentives as a policymaker you can actually use. Can you engage the government or can you not engage the government? If you can't engage the government, you got to work through non-governmental organizations. Sometimes you can engage the government, but only parts of the government. So it's an important distinction to make. Getting back to some of the threats, which are the sort of the meat really of the book, of the 5 chapters. Transnational terrorism. I mean, obviously this is the reason why we've really cared about weak and failing states recently, in recent years. But the evidence is really much more mixed than one might think. I mean, first of all, if you just look at, in other words, that weak and failing states enable terrorism, if you look at where Al-Qaeda has largely been operating, the vast majority of weak and failing states have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In fact, it has a higher presence in some more established countries, for instance, in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, and also in South Asia. There are some exceptions. It's obviously had safe haven in the borderlands of Pakistan, continues to, and in Yemen as well. But too weak is not a good thing for terrorists. An ideal terrorist safe haven is a country that has some institutional weaknesses, but still sort of functions, is somewhat linked to the global economy, but has high levels of corruption. So in that regard, Kenya over the long term is probably a better bet than Somalia. And there's some interesting data to back this up. At West Point, there's a counterterrorism center there, and James Forrest and a number of other folks they got some intercepted cables or intercepted communications between bin Laden when he was in Khartoum in the early 1990s and this Africa Corps that he was trying to send out to the Horn of Africa to establish an Al-Qaeda toehold on the Horn of Africa. And it's hilarious reading this stuff because the complaints that they're sending back to bin Laden are the same as the complaints of UN peacekeepers or the U.S. Army Rangers, and the whole Black Hawk Down episode. They're basically saying these Somalis are impossible. They're unbelievably clannish. There's no operational security. We can't protect ourselves. Everybody has guns. There's no way to no way to transfer finances, and the logistics of transportation are just a mess. What this country really needs is an Islamic state building project. And so the irony, of course, is this is it's like the same thing that the Westerners have been saying, basically. So too weak is not good. Now things have changed in Somalia, and the fact that Al Qaeda has more of a presence there is in part because there's a proto-state there now under the Al-Shabaab movement, the quite extremist sort of would-be Taliban of Somalia. A couple of other things about transnational terrorism. One of them is that we tend to have this distinction between countries that sponsor terrorists and then countries that, well, we'd really like to stop them, we just can't control them. We just don't have control of that area. Now, I think our experience with our Pakistani friends over the last decade has perhaps suggested things are, shall we say, that is clearer than the truth, right? That the Pakistanis have played a double game for a long time with jihadi groups and in part because they have a built-in incentive because they're involved in a territorial dispute with the Indians over Kashmir, and so they've been funding Lashkar-e-Taiba and Lashkar-e-Jangbi, and these other militant groups that have links with the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate in Pakistan, and now it turns out they have lots of links with the Haqqani network, and obviously the Afghan and Pakistan Taliban. Well, maybe not the Pakistan Taliban, but the Afghan Taliban, and perhaps even Al Qaeda. So, there is a blurry line here, but in terms of state will. And the same thing happened in Yemen as well. Saleh, the president of Yemen, really cozied up to a lot of the jihadis because and Sunni extremists, because he wanted to sort of use them for his own internal purposes against his own internal enemies. The other thing that is important when you think about where terrorists would find a hospitable home is it's not just that the country is sort of weak, it's also that there's a hospitable population there. And along the Pakistani borderlands, one of the things that Al Qaeda has been able to benefit from is the Pashtun code of Pashtunwali, which, among other things, has hospitality towards strangers. And so, Al Qaeda was quite integrated for a long time in sort of local villages, marrying into some of the local inhabitants, etc. You contrast that with this other fear when you look at the Trans-Sahel area in sort of Africa, just below the Sahara. There's been a lot of fear that Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, would really make a huge foothold there. But it turns out that despite the fact that there's been Wahhabist influences in the region, that region is also quite strongly under the influence of a more tolerant Sufi version of Islam. So it's just simply the raw material isn't there as much. So that's terrorism. I'll make the others go a little bit more quickly, and I'll probably leave out energy and security. But let's turn to weapons of mass destruction. Now, I mentioned Bob Gates' statement. There has been a fear that countries that are weak and failing would be disproportionately likely to be sources of proliferation of WMD, including nuclear, biological, chemical, and radiological weapons, because they would have less capacity and/or will to actually control the spread of those weapons or the technology. They might sort of sell them on the side, or they might collapse into themselves, and who knows what would happen to those weapons. It turns out that those fears are grossly exaggerated. It turns out that but there are two huge exceptions, and those exceptions would be known to you are North Korea and Pakistan. North Korea, obviously, because it has a major reputation of getting involved with all sorts of nefarious illicit transfers, and you could actually imagine that government selling even with nuclear forensics, where you could trace it back. You could sort of imagine them selling this stuff to a non-state actor or to another country like Burma, which has had a lot of communications with North Korea along these lines. But the other big one is Pakistan, of course, where again the specter of a collapse of a nuclear armed state and who has command and control of those weapons is a huge factor. And then on top of that, the fact that there was this nuclear arms bazaar run around the world by A.Q. Khan, the rogue Pakistani nuclear scientist. Rogue, but sort of, rogue as far as some Pakistanis were concerned, and perhaps not others. But still, the book actually concludes that the biggest WMD threat tends to be from countries that actually rank higher on the index of state weakness. And countries like Syria, which obviously was pursuing nuclear weapons until its facility was taken out, and obviously Iran, but also Russia in some ways, because Russia has a lot of corruption, a lot of weaknesses, and there's also just been this report about a Russian nuclear scientist who was quite instrumental in helping the Iranians make progress on their nuclear program. But it also has a lot of fissile material that may or may not be particularly well guarded. It's a little disturbing the more you read about that, about the status of that. Let me move on to crime. The book looks at 6 different aspects of transnational crime: drug production and trafficking, or trafficking in persons, money laundering, trafficking in small arms and light weapons, environmental crime of a number of different sorts, but it could include poaching and illegal logging, and then finally piracy. Now, no question, in some cases, there's a major link. I mean, the hotbeds of piracy are, Somalia, obviously. The notion that these guys have the capability of to capture huge oil tankers 800 miles into the Indian Ocean, it just blows you away. But they're extremely sophisticated. But this is the chaos of a failed state basically going out to sea. But also Nigeria is also another big one. Oil platforms have been hit 75 miles out, etc. So for piracy, yes. When it comes to narcotics, it's extraordinary the degree to which Afghanistan has virtually cornered the market on the production of opium. I mean, you have to go back to the opium wars in China to have a country that has basically virtually 100% of the market. I think it was at one point up to about 97%. Now it's down to 93% of the global market. Coca, Colombia, which we considered a weak state, although some people, the Colombian embassy was not pleased with that. We actually occasionally got calls from different embassies, and we commented that the fact that they couldn't control 40% of their territory suggested they weren't a strong state. But anyway, it controls probably a plurality or produce a plurality of the world's coca, etc. But when you look at other types of transnational crime, there are certain things like intellectual property violations. Almost none of that's happening in the world's weakest states. Money laundering is another thing. There was a thought that, well, these countries are places where you could do money laundering, and to some degree through informal remittance systems like Hawala, you could see that occurs. But the big money is really has to go through more sophisticated banking systems. And if you want to launder the proceeds of illicit activities, you want a sophisticated banking system. So you're not going to be looking to Niger. You're going to be looking maybe to an offshore banking center, but sometimes you're going to be looking to the City of London and just do it really creatively. So there was very little there. Same thing with human trafficking. I expected this to be the vast majority of cases of human trafficking would be in weak and failing states, but with a few exceptions, including Nigeria, where it's big, and to some degree Burma and Cambodia. The big places tended to be a lot of them were in the Arab world, authoritarian governments where, let's just say, women's rights weren't exactly on the priority of most of the leaders, but they played a huge role in human trafficking. A bigger point also, which with respect to international crime, is that criminals look to try. I mean, they want to maximize profit, right? So they're willing to incur greater risks by operating in environments that are somewhat stronger states than necessarily the world's weakest states. I mean, it's true that there are a few exceptions to this, like Guinea-Bissau, which I couldn't find on a map before a couple years ago, but is in West Africa. Guinea-Bissau has become an incredible transit point for cocaine going from Colombia through West Africa to Europe. In fact, it's estimated that every month, or it was estimated a couple years ago, that every month more cocaine transits this poor country of Guinea-Bissau than the entire country's annual GDP. So there are those issues. But when you look at the real hotbeds of transnational crime, you tend to find actually countries that are a little bit more like South Africa, which has one foot in the developed world and one foot in the developing world. A lot of corruption, but major connections to global logistics and the sinews, the infrastructure of global commerce. Same thing if you look just a little bit south to our own border. Mexico, by no means a failed state, according to the way it would rank lower in the index than it would a couple years ago, to be sure. but by no means a critically weak state. It's located. The reason that it is suffering from so much of this transnational organized crime has so much to do, obviously, with its location and our insatiable demand for illegal narcotics, and also the fact that we've been rather generous in our sharing our small arms and light weapons with them as well, as Secretary Clinton pointed out. The last issue that I want to talk about is infectious disease. Here again, my going-in assumption was, wow, God, the soft underbelly of global public health has got to be, these countries that are really have no epidemiological surveillance capacity. They've got no primary health care, etc. And diseases could easily spread from there that are, hugely problematic. And it's true that a lot of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases have emerged from some of the poorest countries in the developing world. But the more I looked at it, the more I found that the countries that really, the diseases that afflict sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, which has an enormous disease burden, as you all know, tend to be endemic diseases. Things like malaria, to some degree polio, measles, etc. Those are not ones that, they are of incredible humanitarian and development concern, and we have to remember that. But they are not necessarily ones of great immediate security concern. There's also HIV/AIDS, which has been decimating to a lot of these countries. But within the West, I mean, just to put a calculus on it, in the West has become largely manageable through antiretroviral treatment. The big diseases that are hugely problematic in terms of potentially killing tens of millions of if not hundreds of millions of people around the world these days are pandemic influenzas. And in those cases, when you look at the patterns of that, very few of pandemic influenzas have had anything to do with some of the world's weakest countries. They've tended to be coming from parts of Asia in particular, that have particular animal husbandry practices and some ecological dynamics, but are also very well connected to the global economy. So anyway, it just was my plea in this book is, get a little bit more fine-grained, think about how you think about state weakness. Is it a question of will or capacity? And look at the threats a little bit more closely. I do have a number of policy recommendations, which I won't run through now. They may come up in the discussion. I realized I've sort of pushed things. The final thing that I would say is that for these countries, the fragile states, is that we still need to care about them. But we don't necessarily need to frame them as a security problem. We need to care about them for humanitarian issues. They're going to be the countries where the whole responsibility to protect agenda is going to be huge, and their human rights issues are going to be huge. But we also have to care about them for development reasons. To the degree that we care about our fellow brothers and sisters around the world, we care about alleviating poverty. We have to recognize what World Bank President Robert Zoellick said, which is that this is really, these countries that host the bottom billion are really the core challenge of the global development project going forward, and they're the ones that haven't benefited from the tremendous advances that have been made. So I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions. Look forward to a conversation. Thank you.
It's on. If you have a question, if you would come to the mic and ask it from here so that our live streaming friends can pick it up, that would be very appreciated.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. When you're speaking about ungoverned spaces, one area that came to my mind was the tri-border region in South America, which is an ungoverned space amidst functioning states. And I'm wondering, and it's also within our hemisphere. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what the current status is of security threats coming from the tri-border region.
That's an excellent question. That area has, and this is where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina come together. Is that correct? Yeah. That area has gotten a lot of attention, in part because less because of Al-Qaeda presence than the fact that there's a strong Lebanese presence there, and also and conceivably a Hezbollah presence. There are something like 100 airstrips, sort of quasi-clandestine airstrips in the region. My sense is that there has been an effort by the governments involved for greater policing of that region, you make a good point that that even within relatively strong states, you can have pockets of dysfunctional governance, or pockets that are in a sense outside the range of really strong state control, and that's definitely one of them. It's mostly, I think, of concern for crime and various forms of crime. But the same is true in a sense of Mexico, that there are certainly pockets that the government has effectively ceded to the narcotraficantes.
I just wanted to say, if you are asking a question, get very close to the mic. And Stewart, if you could get a little closer
Oh,
to your
sorry.
mic, that would be helpful for our recording. Thank
Gotcha.
you.
Okay. Will do.
And we do have books for sale. And if you
Sorry.
would be so kind as to sign a few at the end.
I would be
and
delighted
they would,
to.
I thought you might be.
I would be. I would be
Okay.
delighted to. Buy early
Anyway.
and often.
They arrived after most people arrived, but they are here,
Okay,
and we'd
yeah.
like to offer them. Okay, thanks.
That's right. They make excellent stocking stuffers.
It is the season.
It is indeed.
Yes. We had a speaker maybe 3 or 4 months ago who is an expert on Yemen,
Okay.
and he was talking about how Yemen is one of the most failed rogue states. Sana'a may be the first city to come apart because lack of water, and what a threat Yemen is as because of its failed status and the difficulty of the government to provide for its people, that it is such a home and a fomenter of terrorism, and what a threat it is to the United States. Could you just give us your opinion on Yemen?
Yeah, I would say
please?
that Yemen probably fits into a category of grave concern, and is an exceptional case in this regard. There is a mini case study on Yemen. There are a number of mini case studies that I do throughout it. In terms of oil and violence in the Niger Delta, for instance. I'll do something else on Burma and transnational health concerns. But there is a pretty long case study in the terrorism chapter right at the end of it on Yemen. And no question, Yemen is a failed state certainly a critically weak state in multiple dimensions. It has this ecological crisis that you pointed out, partly because everybody's growing this mild narcotic khat, and as a result of it, the whole culture revolves around it, and everybody getting a buzz on in the afternoon. The country's awash in arms. It's the water table is virtually dying out, or drying up. The rather modest oil resources that it has are being depleted. It has a demographic explosion, a huge youth bulge. It is a country with a miserable trajectory, and a long-standing government and president who has practiced divide and conquer amongst the different tribes. There have been some tribes that have shielded members of Al-Qaeda, and the country was extremely welcoming to jihadis coming back from mujahideen, basically coming back from the wars in Afghanistan, but also the wars the U.S. supported. Sort of Pakistani efforts during the Cold War. So there's a long tradition of jihadi activity there. It's ambiguous as to whether it sounds like the government has gotten more, taken more of a hard line, and has gotten some religion, no pun intended, through discussions with the United States. It's not going to be, I don't think, long term as hospitable as a place like the Pakistani borderlands. It's obviously, but like in Pakistan, has been the subject of a lot of drone activity as well, which has, it remains controversial as an instrument, but has probably degraded the ability of Al-Qaeda in this case, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, to operate as freely as it would have liked. Thanks.
Can you talk to what you think the role that the United States should play in Afghanistan, and particularly with the Afghan-Pakistan relationship?
Sure, thank you. I've sort of changed my mind on this over the course of time. I had, I probably was more in the state building camp early on, in terms of the notion that if we could get it right, we could help foster an Afghan government that could begin to deliver for its people. I also, though, always thought that it would make more sense to have a little bit more of a radical decentralization of the effort. There's so much mistrust. I mean, Afghanistan has never really been comfortable with a strong centralized state from Kabul, and it's one of the difficulties when it comes to post-conflict reconstruction is that we tend to channel so many of our resources into the capital rather than into the municipalities. And so if there had been more of decentralization, I think that would have helped. Um, but the other problem, of course, was that we never early on put in enough resources, and so as a result, and military resources as well as peacekeeping resources. So as a result, we ended up, tying ourselves to the mast of the warlords, and empowering a lot of the former members of the Northern Alliance and other types, really unsavory characters. And we were defining security in a particular way. We were defining security as to whether or not we had Al-Qaeda on the run. The Afghan government was defining it in terms of whether or not the Taliban was at bay, and the Afghan people were defining it as, why the hell don't we have any rule of law in our country, and we're still at the mercy of these bandits and brigands, and so therefore we're actually pretty sympathetic to the Taliban. I think that in this case, given the tremendous expense of life and money, that the attitude that Vice President Joe Biden was advocating, that we moved more towards a counterterrorism focus, I think, and sort of quarantining and isolating the spillover effects that could emerge as the Taliban gets greater territory. I think we should continue to work on trying to get some sort of reconciliation between the Taliban and the Afghan government. The difficulty there is going to be that is going to be terribly mistrusted by the members of the Northern Alliance, the former Northern Alliance, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, because they'll think that this is an alliance of Pashtun groups. But I think that at this stage, I would side with former Governor Huntsman that maybe it's time to pull back and to leave a residual presence in the country that's involved in counterterrorism activities and make a distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda activities.
Said something about about Yemen wasn't as hospitable as the Pakistan borderlands, and I'm wondering if you're referring to maybe somewhere like Baluchistan, and if you could say something about the connection maybe of Baluchistan and the proposed oil line and the role of China. They've just built up Gwadar port, and I'm wondering how that all feeds in with kind of a large regional power taking advantage of a place like Baluchistan and building up a port like Gwadar.
Sure. When I was referring to the borderlands, I was largely referring to areas northwest frontier provinces, and but they've had the Taliban has had a open presence in Quetta for years, and operating quite in the open, and the Pakistani government playing a double game with them for quite a long time. Baluchistan has obviously been the subject of its own insurgency and sort of separatist activities and sabotage, etc. And so it's obviously of concern to the Pakistani government in terms of, because it has this existential fear that Pakistan itself is going to be fragmented. The prospect of an oil line. I mean, in the ideal scenario, you get Central Asia, you start getting Central Asian and also conceivably Iranian resources, gas resources going through both Afghanistan and Pakistan and ultimately into India. But there are just so many hurdles in the way of that. With respect to Gwadar, which is the port that is a deep water port that the Chinese have been very interested in helping the Pakistanis create on the Indian Ocean, we had meetings with the Indians. I took a team of our group of Council on Foreign Relations senior fellows to India to talk about a number of global issues, and they were increasingly concerned about the Chinese creating sort of a string of pearls strategy within the Indian Ocean, and engaging in a pretty robust strategic competition with the Indians about who was going to have sort of naval mastery ultimately in the Indian Ocean. I think the Chinese have a long way to go before they get there. They're still, trying to create the beginnings of a blue water navy, and they're going to have their hands full in the South China Sea for a while. So I don't think that's going to be a big deal for a while. But still, the Chinese are not about to abandon um, the Pakistanis, and the departure of the United States from Central Asia, including from some of the air bases there, is going to leave a vacuum that could be filled by a number of different countries. And I think it's just going to increase the amount of sort of proxy maneuvering by everybody from Iran to India to Pakistan to China in the area.
Thank you very much for a very informative session. My question would be with regard to Iraq, and now that we seem to be moving out of that region, what is your prognosis for the development of a reasonably effective government?
It's I'm not an expert on Iraq, but I would say that there have been, there still continues to be, efforts by, in a sense, unreconciled Sunni extremists to create sectarian violence, and every time you think that major terrorist activity has ended, there will be some sort of another outrage. My sense is that the country will muddle along in an extraordinarily imperfect effort at representative democracy for a while. It could, at some stage, if the Sunni, it really has to do with whether or not the Sunnis believe that they are going to get a fair shake, and if they continue to believe that they have a place and that we'll get a share of oil revenues and a share of some determination in terms of the future of Iraq, then I think that Iraq will probably muddle through and will make it. But it will be an ugly process. How long do we go?
Thank you.
Okay, fair enough.
That was a very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I have an odd question about this. I have a personal interest in a failed state because I have a pretty new grandchild from Haiti, and therefore I
Sure.
know a fair amount about Haiti. And if you want to look at failed states over generations
Yeah, it's
and the
incredible.
hopelessness, it's
Yeah.
pretty clear.
Mhm.
But what I started to think about is we consider each of those separately, and we consider what is an appropriate role for the United States in these things. And so my question was, does anybody, when this discussion is going on, try to evaluate do we have any sort of a moral duty because we are who we are to help a country like Haiti? Do we, when we consider bombing Iran, eliminate that just because they could mine the Straits of Hormuz? Or where is the money question in here? Where do we think about the economic conditions in this country in terms of whether it's worth our while to nation build in Afghanistan? I mean, of course you should nation. What about the girls in Afghanistan? And what about the kids in Haiti? And is this ever put together, or is it considered in little pieces?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that Bismarck was quoted as saying that the Balkans were not worth the bones of a single
That's right.
Pomeranian grenadier, and I wrote in one article that we ultimately concluded after the Black Hawk Down episode that the fate of Somalia was not worth the bones of 18 U.S. Army Rangers, and that may have been a decent calculus to make, but you're making in some ways a moral calculus about how important the suffering of strangers is, and how important, as the world gets more interdependent, how cosmopolitan you want to be. And the way that we spend money, I think probably no or very few U.S. taxpayers would say we should devote as much sort of social welfare spending, for instance, to the average Afghan as to the average American, or that we should spend as much effort, sort of nation building in a sense, in those countries as we do in our own country? The answer is that there's no, but that calculus is made, in a very haphazard way.
And in separate pieces.
And it's very much in separate pieces. Just a couple words on Haiti. I think that, in Haiti and Liberia, you have seen rationales for going in that sort of are a combination of, well, at least for Haiti, it's off of our shores, so it could create sort of a refugee problem. We've seen that in the past. But then there's also the notion that we have a responsibility since it's in our hemisphere. With Liberia, we have a responsibility, arguably, for historical reasons, and arguably with Haiti as well, because for the first 60 years of Haiti's existence, because it was, of course, the product of a slave revolt, we weren't helping them. We weren't even recognizing them. And it has had such a pathological pattern of politics over the years. The one thing about the difficulty with Haiti, which you've probably seen, is that it has become basically the country of NGOs, where NGOs provide everything. And so we've built a culture of dependency in that country that just plays into the pathological politics.
Not perfect either.
Right, exactly. So it's a very, we have an obligation, but we also have an obligation to try to figure out and to keep experimenting with types of delivery of foreign assistance in a way to make sure that it's as effective as possible for U.S. taxpayers that also want to, I'm sympathetic with the idea of, hey, we got a lot of crumbling infrastructure here. We got a lot of crumbling schools.
And we have kids who aren't
Right.
educated.
Right, exactly. So, yeah. It was an interesting question. It's a sort of broad philosophical conundrum.
Thanks for trying.
Yeah, I give it a shot.
Yeah, I just had a question about how globalized is your index. In other words, if we talk to someone in England or France or Saudi Arabia or some other place, would they recognize your index, and would you have consulted with their opinions about what makes a failed state and what makes a weak state? Or is this an American view?
They would be just thrilled with it. No, I would say that's an interesting question. I have taken this on the road abroad to a couple of cases early on with the index, and it's broadly in keeping within the donor community. In other words, the OECD world, the advanced industrial democracies, all of them have development ministries, and the four categories of state function that we talk about are ones that have been broadly accepted, and each government does its own sort of version of one of these indices. It just doesn't release them by and large because it's too politically sensitive, but it uses it for its internal purposes. However, the language of the failed state is often very controversial, and using that language because, and here I do want to make a broader point here. It's too easy to say, well, the problem's all out there and it's created by these failed states and they're going to hell in a handbasket, as if they're not integrated into a larger global system that can have some pretty deleterious impacts on what they're doing and how they're doing. And so the fact is that a lot of countries in the developing world are doing poorly in part because we provide places where kleptocrats can hide their assets offshore because of prohibition regimes. What everyone thinks about drug legalization versus prohibition, the truth is that when you prohibit something and you artificially inflate the profits, and so you make it incredibly lucrative, and so to some degree, we don't have to get into legalization debate, but one perverse consequences that you help create a lot of problems. In addition, a lot of Western domiciled corporations have been involved in incredible trade in illicit commodities around the world, et cetera, and in bribing foreign governments, et cetera. So I think that when I presented this to others outside the United States, I think they very quickly will point to that aspect. They'll also point to the question of how would the United States rank. We thought about ranking in the industrial world. We decided not to. I'm not sure what it would have done for our aspirations for public service later on, but it would be interesting to find out how the United States ranks on some aspects of social welfare, for instance. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It's been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you all feel as I do that this was a great presentation, and goodness, I made a lot of notes, which I don't usually do, so a lot of food for thought. We had a question about the presentation on Yemen that we had this summer, and I'm sorry to tell you that we have had word that Christopher Busek died very suddenly about 6 weeks ago. So I think that's a real loss to the United States and to the international community, and I know you'll share my thoughts on that. We don't have any other information. He did leave 2 children, one very young. A little commercial, of course. I hope you'll all join us on the 8th of December for Phil Wilcox. That will be at this time of day at the Denver Country Club, and we'll be looking at the question of Israel-Palestine in the U.S., is the peace process dead? And that will be our last program for this year. In January, and I have to, in the being honest, tell you that our first speaker in January, Catherine Curtis Donahue, is a personal friend of mine who I've known for a number of years. She's an anthropologist who has written an astounding book about Zacharias Moussaoui, the slave of Allah, in which, as an anthropologist, she has tried to look at the question, among other things, of why does an Islamic young man, mainstream, living in France, become a radical, and how did the United States handle the issue of his lack or his involvement or lack thereof in 9/11. I think you'll find it is a tremendously interesting presentation. A friend of mine has read the book recently and said it is the most fascinating, frustrating, and infuriating book that he has ever read. So just a little sales pitch there. And then in February, Michael Schur, who is really a contrarian when it comes to our U.S. foreign policy. And I think he will provide an interesting counterpoint to some of the other speakers that we've had recently. So happy holidays, gobble gobble. We'll see you in December, and thanks for coming. And books outside.